Good afternoon and welcome to FIU Insights, Florida International University's panel discussions on some of the pressing issues we all face in today's world. Today's panel discussion will be Elections 2020, looking at South Carolina, Super Tuesday, and the upcoming vote here in Florida. With the Democratic hopefuls focused on South Carolina for the vote this coming Saturday, the race for president will take a big turn next Tuesday when we have the Super Tuesday ballots in many states, with some 40% of the population going to cast their votes. Senator Bernie Sanders has emerged as the front runner, though his recent comments on Cuba and the legacy of Fidel Castro have raised many eyebrows among Democrats here in Florida, especially here in southern Florida. So how will South Carolina turn out? How will Super Tuesday turn out? And how will the voting in Florida go? And what will this look like as we face the upcoming race against President Trump, looking at November 2020? Here to join us are three outstanding experts from FIU. To my immediate left is Eduardo Gamarra, who's a professor in Department of Politics and International Relations in the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Next to him, Catherine DiPaolo, instructor, Department of Politics and International Relations, also with the Green School. And next to her is Dario Moreno, associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations, also with the Green School. So many thanks to all three of you for joining us for this very timely discussion here today. And Eduardo, let me start with you. Give us a sense of your impressions from Tuesday's debate in Charleston.
Well, the Democratic Party has been hosting some very interesting. I mean, I think we're on 10 now, and the last two have been rather raucous. Have been really more than anything else. I would say they reflect what's going on in the party. Several options that have essentially polarized the party as well, and that tell us that the direction that the party is taking, at least heading into the convention, is really quite uncertain, with a candidate like Bernie Sanders who might command the lead in terms of delegates, but who might not reach the majority of delegates. And even if he doesn't reach a majority of delegates, with the possibility of affecting the outcome. So I think, you know, that these debates have been interesting, the last two very raucous, but I think it leaves the party in a rather serious state of affairs.
And the moderators seem to have lost control of the last debate. I'll try not to do that here today. But Catherine, let me turn to you and ask you, there was not a lot of discussion in Tuesday's debate about President Trump. A lot of it seemed to be focused on each other. It reminds me a little bit of 2016 with the Republican primaries.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of those candidates on the stage felt this was a last-ditch effort to talk to the voters, and I think that's why we saw a lot of infighting that might actually turn off voters who have been watching all of these debates and sort of throw up their hands with, you know, what is happening. So these candidates, I think, going into now the fourth state, going into South Carolina on Saturday, feel like this is now or never. And then we have Super Tuesday 3 days after that. And I can see some of the almost desperation on some of their faces to really stay in the race going forward.
And Dario, let me ask you, Mike Bloomberg, former mayor of New York, has been a late entrant in these. He's still, I believe, not on the ballot in South Carolina, but he will be for Super Tuesday. How do you see his role in all this?
Well, it's very entertaining watching someone take $500 million, pour gasoline on it, and light it up on national TV.
Only 360, but
well, no, and when you add everything up, the ground game as well. I mean, his performance has been underwhelming. He's let Elizabeth Warren bully him. He's dropped in the polls. If you look at the Real Clear Politics average, he's dropped like 10%. And I think all this has been to the advantage of Joe Biden, who might have another political life after being written off again. It seems now pretty clear that he will do well on Super Tuesday, despite Trump and the Republicans getting out a get out the vote drive for Bernie among Republicans in South Carolina. I believe the KGB is all over the operation. The second But more importantly, on Super Tuesday, which is just 3 days away, Biden looks poised to do well in Alabama, North Carolina, Tennessee. The real question on Super Tuesday, what is to watch on Super Tuesday? It's Texas. If Bernie wins Texas, I think then he's going to go into the convention maybe with 1,800, 1,900 delegates, and it'd be very difficult to deny him the nomination. If he loses Texas, then the number is reduced substantially, and Biden really has a fighting chance. And by the way, what I think is fascinating, everybody's talking about reducing the field, right? To have a moderate lane and a
Progressive
lane. Thank you. And to me, it seems that that's a misunderstanding. And if you looked at 2016, what happened to the Republicans, people are not as ideological as political commentators and pundits in this panel. So it's not that people go rationally. So it's better off, in my mind, if you really want to stop Sanders, that people stay in the race and go to the convention with their group of delegates, like they used to do in the battle days, right?
But that assumes, Dario, that they would do well in each of those primaries, because they would have to command more than the 1 or 2% that some of those candidates are getting to achieve what you're saying.
Yeah, but to my point is Warren needs to stay in for Massachusetts, which is on Super Tuesday. Klobuchar is ahead in Minnesota.
Right.
And so it makes sense for them to run in their home state, bank the delegates, and then they'll have a voice at the convention.
Right.
But Catherine, let me ask you, is South Carolina do or die for anyone, or does it just make sense to wait until Super Tuesday, since, as Dario said, it's just a few days after South Carolina?
Well, I think it's do or die for Joe Biden. You know, the media's pretty much written him off, and all of a sudden he's coming roaring back. You know, with the debate performance, you see the polls going up in South Carolina, where I think some voters were wavering. Maybe we'll look at somebody else. They've looked at everybody else, and I think they're probably going to come home to Joe Biden. So if he wins the state of South Carolina, and I think a win is sufficient. I don't believe it has to be a big win. He stays in this race and then takes that momentum into Super Tuesday, where I think it would be a Biden-Sanders face-off at that particular point. And if you look at the polls in each of those particular states, Sanders is winning in almost every state except those 3 southern states that Dario mentioned. So he is the one to beat, right? And if you have voters who are saying, well, I don't want Sanders, so who do I go to next? I think Biden might be that person. But if Joe Biden comes in, you know, third or worse, he's done, and I think he's out.
And what about from a fundraising perspective? That's obviously critical, although for candidates like Steyer and the mayor of New York, they have endless amount of money. But for other candidates, if they don't do well, the fundraising is going to dry up.
It's going to dry up completely. Right. And in fact, I'm surprised that some of the smaller performances have still managed to command some funding. But I think after Tuesday, that's it. If they don't perform well, the funding is going to dry up for them. So I think, to Dario's point, if they don't perform well, they will probably not be alive after that. If they do, and they do what you're saying, which is probably the best thing for the Democrats if they're trying to stop Sanders, then the fundraising may not stop for them.
Mm-hmm. You want to jump in?
I just want to say something that I think needs to be said. The people I feel sorry for, Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, who actually in a normal campaign cycle, and I guess we don't have normal campaign cycles anymore, would have been got all the media attention. But given that the Democrats can't count votes in Iowa or in Palm Beach or in Broward, their bounce was stolen. They never got that Iowa bounce. They never got a New Hampshire bounce because of Bloomberg. So kind of outside forces have really hurt what could have been a fairly attractive moderate candidates.
Catherine, I just saw a headline that the Dow has plunged again today. And the economy has been a difficult issue for Democrats to seize on because it has been doing very well. Could that change, particularly in light of the administration's handling of the coronavirus, do you think?
It could. I was just talking today that this could be Trump's Katrina. And, George W. Bush had this happen after his second, election. So, it was job approval and that sort of thing. But this is going into an election year. This could all be an overreaction. I think we're all hoping that's what it could be. But if there's bungling by the administration, this is Trump talking about being a CEO and taking charge and having the economy be what he can run on. I mean, he's a businessman. That's really all he's concerned about. It's what he tweets about every day. He's very concerned. And economic conditions are also about perception, just like politics is about perception. So I think that's the one undoing that could happen in this election year that could take Trump down that we hadn't thought about maybe even a week or two ago.
So let me shift to some foreign policy. And one particular issue that's very close to home here is, of course, Cuba. And Bernie Sanders' comments about the Castro regime and its legacy on education and literacy. How do you think that's going to play? Will it have any effect on Sanders' support?
Well, that's obviously been the question that's been most on our minds in South Florida, and I'm really troubled by some of Sanders' statements and what he's thinking, because he's made several statements over the last few years. I mean, he's made statements about Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. He's made statements about Evo Morales in Bolivia, all along these lines. And at the same time, in one of the debates, when he was asked, well, in fact, it was with Bloomberg, where Bloomberg suggested that he was a communist, and he got offended that I'm no communist. I'm from Finland or something like that, right? It's really quite interesting to watch because it looks like outside of Florida, the reaction is not as severe as it is here. And clearly we know that. But here the issue is that, because we face this, even in our classes we face this, right? With some students on the right often defending dictators like Pinochet or some, dictators on the right and saying, they were really bad guys. They committed all of these human rights abuses, but look at the wonderful things they did for the economy. And I think that, that Sanders is doing essentially the same thing. And that is, I think, is if he is the candidate for the Democrats, he will likely lose Florida for the Democrats, just on the basis of that. And why do I say that? Because the vote in this state has historically been so narrow that even, I'm watching some of our Cuban American Democrats who are appalled by his remarks, and who are even going on radio saying that they would never vote, even though they're Democrats, that they would never vote for Sanders. So I think, for the party as such, that nomination, and I know that there are scenarios to the White House without Florida, but they are very difficult scenarios. Yeah. And so without Florida, I don't see a path to the White House. And with Sanders as the nominee, I think it'll be even more difficult.
Well, I think all Sanders has to do is keep the states that Clinton won, and I don't see him or any Democrat losing those blue states. And then flip Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and that would give him 278 electoral votes. So, this idea, the Democrats, I think, can win without Florida.
But it's a difficult path.
Sure, but Republicans have to win Florida, and that's the other story.
But you're also suggesting that it is a mistake for those Democrats who think if Bernie Sanders is the nominee, then all hope is lost. That there is a path that Sanders has to victory.
Right. I mean, I think, we're looking at this 4 years ago where you had everybody say Trump can never win, and he can never win here, and he can never win there. And Republicans always thought they could win Pennsylvania for 20 years. Oh, it's in play. It was never in play. And then on election night, we see he wins Florida, and all of a sudden Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan are flipping. So if you could, and those were very, very close. So if you could switch those votes and you could get into the white working class vote, which Bernie and his message could appeal to, you just need to change a few thousand votes, and I think he could certainly win the Electoral College.
Well, first of all, let me completely agree with Catherine and Eduardo. I mean, Catherine is right. I think that Bernie can appeal to some of the white working class vote better than Bloomberg can, from a cultural perspective and from what he cares about perspective. But I think for the local congressional Democrats, they have a huge problem. Because what Democrats did with the impeachment, they burned the ships as far as Trump. Because whenever you were caught in the past in a situation where you're running against a popular incumbent and you were a congressman or down ballot, you could always say, I can work with the president, I can work with this issue. When you accuse the president and find him guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors, you burn that ship. You know, how can the local Congress people endorse someone that they try to get impeached, or even vote for him, or even wink? I mean, in a way, Bernie has them over the barrel. They're committed to the Democratic ticket, no matter what they're saying on radio.
What happens, though, to moderates and independents? If Sanders is the Democratic nominee, how does he win over those kinds of voters?
Look, I think that that's a very, very difficult question to answer, because the moderates that I know of, right, and I would include myself among those, I think it's very difficult. And when I just this morning talking to Cuban Democrats who basically have told me we will not vote for Sanders, right? And I think when you look at it in some other states, even
it isn't just because of his comments about the Castro regime.
And
right.
and it has to do a lot with other issues. You know, I mean, you can look specifically at some of the healthcare issues, the funding issues related to and the overall health of the economy, frankly. So I think this is a very interesting time for the Democrats. I think perhaps there's an exaggeration to his point, but the reality is that the Democrats have allowed the Republican Party to set the agenda. And what the Republicans did is they said this is where we're fighting about socialism versus capitalism, and the socialist is going to win for us, and we're going to have to battle against really the foremost representative of U.S. capitalism. And so some people are even telling me I would rather vote for Trump. I would never vote for Sanders. So,
Catherine, Florida is not part of Super Tuesday, but can we expect a lot of the candidates to flood Florida after Super Tuesday to try to win the vote here?
Well, defining what a lot means, right, is who's left after Super Tuesday.
Right.
But I'm sure they're going to come to Florida because, in a general election sense, they still want Florida's electoral votes. And I think right now we have people who are voting absentee. Early voting starts March 7th, so you're going to have probably 2/3 of the vote already in before March 17th, or actual election day. So to think that Florida is unimportant until that date really doesn't look at the landscape of how people vote, for sure.
Dario, Donald Trump's dream candidate to run against and Donald Trump's worst nightmare?
Well, I think the candidate he's most afraid of is Michael Bloomberg, because Trump respects money, if nothing else, right? And $60 billion is impressive. I think his favorite candidate to run on will probably be Bernie or Warren, because he thinks he can frame it in the way Eduardo suggests. But be careful what you hope for. Be careful what you dream for, because I remember one of my colleagues saying the Republican Party is doomed in 2016. It's the end of the Republican Party, and it wasn't. And Trump pulled out. I think one of the scary things we see. I mean, I think where we're going through right now, and I try to put my arms around it, is we're going through a realignment. And it's not a traditional realignment. It's both parties' establishment have been attacked. In the Republican Party, there was a hostile takeover by Donald Trump. In the Democratic Party, we look like we're on the way for a hostile takeover by Sanders. So I'm not willing to make any predictions beyond that it's going to be a nasty race. And what worries me with a Trump-Sanders ticket and the and some of the items, some of the other Democratic candidates were complaining about is sort of political violence in a scale that this country is not used to seeing, where you have people from both camps disrupting each other's events and maybe the use of violence. I don't want to sound alarmist.
Or even, if I can interrupt you, Dario, you know, even the possibility of sort of a repeat scenario of 2016, although here with Sanders winning the popular vote, right, and Trump winning the electoral vote, that repeat scenario could be very, very complicated. And I think that, you know, to your point earlier about flipping a few states, when you look at the polls in those states and how close they are, right, that's really where I think the big issue is.
Well, one of the areas I disagree with Catherine about just a little bit is if you look at New Mexico and Minnesota, those are flippable for the Republicans. Right, and there's a demographic game too, right? And it depends how the demographics go, because you know. But look, I think the real danger we have is we're increasingly polarized. A Trump-Sanders general election will be extremely polarizing, and both sides are going to demonize each other. In the worst possible way.
So, Catherine, let me ask you, before we actually get to a November race, Sanders versus Trump, is there a possibility that the Democrats could face a brokered convention where no one secures enough delegates for the nomination straight out?
Absolutely. I mean, the way that they award their delegates in each of these states is not what Republicans do, which is winner take all. And even in 2016, it took some extra time to sort out. We had so many candidates then. Well, this is even greater, and I think all of these different percentages and proportions that they win in each state is very confusing, and I think, you know, certainly if someone does not have a majority and no other candidate is willing to, before the convention, to release those delegates, we could have a mess. I remember watching this in 2016, and the DNC chair, our congresswoman from down here, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, faced a revolt. I mean, even in the room with the Florida delegation was so heated. So, you know, these are the kinds of things that I think we can see. And I think Bernie supporters are Bernie supporters. And I don't know that they necessarily will vote for a Democrat. They will vote for him. So going into a convention, you know, if it's not, if there's no clear winner, right, and even if it's not Sanders, if there's really no clear winner, you know, this could really be a mess for the Democrats going forward.
And let me just remind our viewers, you can send a question in on our Facebook page. Eduardo, as far as I remember, I don't recall an election, if it comes down to Sanders versus Trump, of two 70-year-old white men facing off against each other. Does that raise the stakes for the vice presidential picks of both sides? Presumably it's Pence, although you do continue to hear rumors that Pence could be replaced either by Nikki Haley or someone, and then Sanders would also have an important pick to make.
Well, you know, first I think, you know, as a 62-year-old, I feel like a teenager these days, you know, and because it is remarkable to watch these. I mean, it's not just Trump, it's not just, I mean, everybody except for, you know, Buttigieg is, you know, so right, and but again, she's way over 50 if I'm not mistaken. So, you know, fairly, you know, but which would be normal, you know. But when you think about it, Obama retired at 55, right? Yeah. So that in and of itself just is a demographic comment. But look, I think both candidates will have a very difficult time deciding. I think it's really going to be balancing the ticket for the Democrats. And are you going to have a Bernie with somebody that's more moderate to try to balance and bring in the other sectors, which is probably going to be what's going to happen. And if it's a Biden, who does he bring in? Does he bring in a progressive, right? So I think the Democrats have a difficult choice. I don't want to speculate on the Republicans because, in fact, it doesn't look like it's broken. So, you know, so why fix it?
Dario, let me ask you, if he were to be elected, Sanders would be the first Jewish president elected, but he's also made some controversial comments about Israel. Give us a sense of how you think that plays, particularly here in Florida.
Well, I mean, the Jewish community, as you know, is very divided. I mean, there are religious Jews who are very pro-Trump because of his policy toward Israel, and so there's a strong support. But the vast majority of Jews in the United States are secular, and so they have traditionally been very supportive of the Democratic Party. A Sanders ticket will lose some of that vote because of some of his policies in the Middle East. So, you know, those, but I think, and, you know, and why I don't count Sanders out is the traditional view of election up to 2004 was you have 45% of the country is on the right, 45% is on the left, center right, center left, and you fight over the 10% in the middle. Now our elections are, I'm going to win because my 45% are going to vote at a higher number than your 45%. And it's more about whipping up the base than it is about appealing to moderates and independents. And there's where Sanders has an advantage over Biden and Bloomberg and some of the other Democrats who aren't able. I mean, if you look at Sanders rallies, Sanders crowds, they're a mirror image of Trump's with the same kind of populist rhetoric. And who else can get 5,000, 10,000 people to show up on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in San Antonio for a rally, right? Which Sanders was able to do. So, you know, I think we have to, again, I think everything is changing so radically right now about how American politics is played. I mean, now, I would argue that a Biden-Trump debate will be very interesting. And the difference will be Trump will know he's lying. Biden won't know he's lying.
Catherine, we just have a few minutes left. Let me just ask you about the Senate and the House. What impact do you think a Sanders nomination, a Sanders Democratic nominee, could have on Senate prospects?
Well, I mean, you see Democrats worrying that they will absolutely lose the Senate. There's even talk of possibly the House going back to Republican control. So I think there's a real danger in how that particularly plays. But again, you know, I mean, these Sanders voters are so committed to Sanders, and they're going to vote Democrat down ballot if they show up. So, you know, I think some of that could be tempered, and we'd have to go really state by state to figure this out when we get really into the fall to figure out, you know, what these races are looking at. But I think looking at this particular race, you know, I would not count Sanders out either at this particular point to get that base out and help down ballot.
And turnout, who wants high turnout, who wants lower turnout?
Well, that's exactly going back to what Dario said. You know, these two candidates on the right and on the left are going to turn out their bases. The moderates of their, you know, Biden, you know, doesn't generate much excitement, you know. None of the other candidates generate that kind of excitement. So I think, you know, it's unfortunate to see on the Democratic side, even if you look at it from different demographic groups, you know, we've been able to really massively increase the registration among Hispanics. But it's still very disappointing on election day, save, you know, a couple of different areas. So I think, you know, if you don't have candidates at the top that generate that kind of excitement, and more than anything else, not just excitement, because it's devotion, really, what it boils down to. If you don't have Sanders as the candidate, the Democrats, I don't know if they can get out the vote.
Dario, last word to you.
Well, you know, what I found fascinating about this election cycle is diversity didn't play.
Yeah.
Women didn't play, and the women were supposed to, you know, this was their turn. The minority votes, the minority candidates didn't do well. In fact, the Republicans have a better record with minority candidates. Both Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio won states, unlike the Democratic minority candidates. So I think there's it's very interesting that, the leading candidates, if you view, it's either going to be Trump, Sanders, or Trump, Biden, are 70-year-old white males from the East Coast.
78-year-old.
Yeah.
That's right, to be exact.
Yeah, almost 80.
All right, well, Dario Moreno, Catherine DePaulo, Eduardo Gamarra, thank you so much for joining us here today. This 30 minutes went by very quickly. Fascinating discussion. I didn't ask you who the race will be up against. We'll do that on our next time after Super Tuesday is over, perhaps. But thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. I'm David Kramer, Senior Fellow in the Green School here at FIU. Thanks very much for joining us for FIU Insights, and we look forward to welcoming you on the next occasion. Thanks.